Amid a movement, millions have taken to the streets to call not just for justice in individual instances of injustice or violence at the hands of armed officers of the state, but people calling for change to the systemic issues that lead to those violent outcomes. And I wanted to kind of start our discussion today by getting your idea of the state of the movement. And Scott, we'll start with you. Where do you see the current state of the movement as it's seeking to accomplish such immense goals on such a massive scale?
Patrick, I tend to have a tendency to want to look at the positive, but unfortunately, this is it's a mess, and it's not a new mess. It's a mess that we've seen not only for years, not just for decades, but for centuries. It's a mess that we've created, and there's this systemic racism that exists that has manifested itself in ugly, ugly ways for for generations, and there's a time for it to stop. And we look at the problems that we have now, and really all we have to do is look back at our history and pay attention to the patterns of behavior, again, primarily with people that look like me and who are now all of a sudden wanting to make a change or saying they want to make a change, and it's time to make a change.
And Dr. Rice, looking at the way that these discussions have kind of flowed through everyone, where do you see the state of the movement?
I mean, I want to err on the side of positive. Also, I always believe in accenting the positive. So the fact that there is a groundswell and that there's attention given to this idea of systemic racism is so important. But this is still just one step forward in a long going process. I mean, we can go back to the quote unquote civil rights era that has just extended to the now, and so there's a lot of work to be done. The thing that's encouraging is that there is conversation about it. There are actions that are being engaged in, but it's a time for looking at accountability, and then looking at historical and present complicity in what it is that we're dealing with in terms of social justice, and then doing work in looking at how it is that you maintain social impact.
And I'll take a page out of y'all's positivity in that more people have been brought into this conversation that as recently as a week, month, a year ago, weren't a part of the conversation. And the general reaction from a lot of the people I talk to is why now? They witnessed the murder of one man on their phones or on television, but these are the murders that we've been seeing for years. But in terms of there is something different. The fact that we're able to have this conversation on a national medium from the NFL right now is indicative of just how different that conversation is. But we do, Justin, kind of have to look at what it took to start this conversation, right? The conversational space created first by protests in the NFL, just a small part of that alongside all of these murders that we've had to witness. How do you react, I guess, to what it took and kind of where we are now in terms of the conversation?
I definitely think that it's upsetting to know that a lot of unarmed Black people and Black people in general have been calling attention to these issues for a long time. But I will, be optimistic about it, because it is good that, a lot of people are starting to join the cause. And I love that it's a very multicultural and diverse group. When you go to the protests, there's a lot of people of different races leading these protests and participating in these protests, which I love. And I think it really it was a perfect storm. Obviously, with COVID and everything happening with that, people couldn't look away. And then you have social media, everyone has a phone, everyone turns into a journalist. And you see not only the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but countless others. And then you see these protests happening where there's a lot of police brutality happening at the protest against police brutality, right? So I think it's just hard to look away. And I'm glad that everyone's paying attention to it now and trying to join in on the cause, because it's going to take a multicultural, multi-generational movement to change something that is so systemic and endemic within American culture.
David used, or Dr. Rice used the word accountability, and I think this is a really important part of where we have to be and where we've got to go now. Again, throughout history, we have seen, again, people like me have seen and ignored so much. And there's been these consistent patterns of behavior over years and centuries, and we've got to make a change. And here's what we can't allow happen in this moment is every couple of decades we have these uprisings, right? We have the protests, and again, forgive me, this is all wonderful. It's we're having these protests, but we need action. We need real action. We need sustained action. Part of what we always miss with this is there's never this sustained action and really doing things. And we have this history in this country of creating policies, systems, programs, all of these things that we say at this moment, again, people that look like me, in this moment, we want to correct something. And then we make this market correction, for a lack of a better term, and then we don't follow up and we don't chase after ourselves. We don't keep accountability. Again, I've been in the NFL forever, and as a simple example that I use is, we've had the Rooney Rule, and we've had the Bill Walsh Diversity Fellowship Program. We create these policies, we create these systems, then 20 years we get down the line and we've seen people that either circumvent or the policies in place, or they become stagnant and we don't grow and change, because every time we put a policy or a program in place, we have to keep it living and keep it working to truly accomplish the things that we say we want to accomplish.
Yeah, I really appreciate what it is that Scott's offered there, because I think that so often when we're looking at the violence that is racism, and we look at the violence that we see illustrated in terms of anti-Black racism, we want to do something. We want to fix it. We want to put policy in place. We want to look at how it is that we can be active. And I think that's important. But I also think that it's a both and dilemma, because I think that the most difficult thing to do right now in this moment, still, even though we have a little bit of distance from these brutal killings, and we know that Breonna Taylor's killers are still at large, and I'll use that language intentionally there. But one of the things that becomes really important for us to do is not just attach ourselves to activities or to policies, and that's not to minimize that at all, but it's really important for us to get into our own psyche. What is it that we believe? And I think that it's important for Black folk now to make sure that we are holding our white brothers and sisters accountable. And I know that I'm talking in terms of polarity right now, and that's also intentional, because I think it's important for us to look at the original sin of anti-Black racism that is 1619 and is the Ma'afa, is the transatlantic slave trade. The original sin of the Americas has to do with the eradication of Native peoples and the exploitation of Black bodies. And I think that with white folk wrestling with that, that's something Black folk experience and understand in terms of contextually within the northern, North America. But I think that what's happening now is white folks are having to look not only at these media images, but they're also having to look in the mirror. And there is so much cognitive dissonance that's saying, well, I'm not a racist. And I think one of the things that's important to underscore here is that if we're talking about systemic racism, you might not be a racist, but you're racist. Meaning that if we're looking at individual racism, if we're looking at cultural racism, if we're looking at institutional racism, unless you are actively pushing against this racist structure, you are benefiting from cultural and systemic racism and institutional racism. And that means that you are privileging off of the backs of people who have done work for you. And so that becomes very, very difficult for us to have a conversation around. It's a lot more comfortable to say that, we've checked this box, we've checked this box, and we've checked this box. Those boxes being checked are tremendously important. But we really have to look at, when we're looking at systems, they really do start with the hearts and minds of the people who are in leadership positions. And it's important for us as folks who are oftentimes put in the margins to hold those people who understand power positions as being accountable and complicit in a racist context in society.